Governor Brian Schweitzer is here with us this afternoon. We're very grateful for your time and presence. Something John McBride and I have admired about Governor Schweitzer for a long time from afar, from our state in Colorado, is that he is dedicated and loyal to the notion about not seeing himself or his state in partisan terms. And to us, that's quite essential too, because as independents, it really is not about what color your state is, or even if it's a blend of purple, but how we really get things done. And clearly, Governor Schweitzer has given great leadership to Montana, but also in the West, about what it could look like to have a governor that is leading in this style. So please help me welcome Governor Schweitzer.
Thank you very much. Actually, last October, I was in Colorado, and Bill Ritter, who's a friend of mine, asked me to come down and see if we couldn't raise a few shekels for him, and Roy Romer came back to Colorado, and so the three of us were at this fundraiser at the home of Jim Crow in Denver. And the two of them spoke first, and then I spoke last, and I said to the people that were there, I said, you know, if you want your child to grow up to be President of the United States, you should send your child to Yale. Yale is the University of Presidents. I think 7 of the presidents, maybe even more, if you count George Bush. Went to Yale. And so I said, but if you would like your child to be a governor, if you would like your child to grow up and change the world on a local basis, if you'd like your child to be do the things that are done on the ground to change the world, not talk about it in Washington, D.C., but to do it on the ground, you should send your child to Colorado State University, because that is the University of Governors, because Roy Romer, Bill Ritter, and Brian Schweitzer all went to Colorado State University. You know, you're thinking right now, those of you from outside of Montana, you think, well, this is really something. The governor comes over and speaks, and there's only, you know, a few hundred people here. That's really quite a coup here. And, well, actually, as it turns out, not so much. I go a lot of places. In fact, I'm 2 or 3 towns every day. Like this morning, I was in Browning on the Blackfeet Indian Reservation. We dedicated a new water project, and they have North American Indian Days going on, so I dropped the hat on the Indian relay race. I don't know if you've been, anybody see that kind of horse racing? I was at the Kentucky Derby. Those of you who live in Montana know that because, well, Republicans made a big deal that I apparently went to a horse race, and so I was at the Kentucky Derby, and so I was watching these races, and folks were watching this race, and every once in a while a jockey would bump the horse, or somebody's crop would look like it might have touched another horse, and there would be a question about whether they were going to be disqualified or not. And I said to these folks in Kentucky, this is not horse racing. I'll tell you what horse racing is. Indian relay race is horse racing. This is the way this works. You have 1 jockey and 3 horses per team, and you do 3 rounds around. And when that jockey comes around at a full gallop, he jumps off at a full gallop. This is bareback, by the way. And at a full gallop, and jumps on the other horse and takes off, and they do 3 times around. And there's no question about bumping the other horse. Everything goes, including reaching over and grabbing the braid of the other one and jerking them off the horse. So this is real horse racing, Western style. But you know, I do travel around Montana. I speak to a lot of groups, and for example, in the spring, I speak to a lot of graduation groups. A couple of years ago, I even spoke at the University of Montana, which was quite remarkable because I'm quite recognized around Montana. I went to graduate school over at Montana State University. For those of you who are outside Montana, that's the other university. And I wasn't booed when I spoke here in Missoula, and that was a great thing. But I get about 100 invitations every spring to speak at graduations, and I try to make it to some 8th grade graduations, some high school graduations, some university graduations. And this year, like last year and the year before, almost everybody who asked me to speak at their graduation got a letter in the mail from my schedule that said, well, unfortunately, the governor won't be able to make it to your graduation because there is a conflict in his time. He can't make it on that day. Well, the graduating class of one of these schools sent me another letter back, and this letter said that since this graduating class consisted of one person, me, I will change my graduation to the time when the governor can come. So I spoke at the Freud graduation in extreme northeastern Montana to one graduate and the whole town. And when they introduced me, the principal introduced me, and he said that they had done the research. They'd gone back the 83 years that the school had been in this little town of Freud. They had never had a governor in 83 years even come to the school, let alone speak at their graduation. And so when I took the podium, I said to the people that were present, and you have to understand the politics of Montana. This is extreme northeastern Montana. I said to them, you wait 83 years for a governor to come to your school, and it turns out he's a dang Democrat. Gee, how bad can it be? Oh, by the way, this young lady, Roxy Britton, who had the moxie to demand that I spoke at her graduation and who changed her graduation day to Mother's Day just so I would come, she will go far. In fact, she's already been on the Ellen DeGeneres show talking about her graduation. She will go far. I'd like to talk to you today, and I want to make sure that I've got this thing. Jason, what do I need to do? There we go. Now, there we go. Now, take a good hard look at that map, because this is going to affect the rest of your life, your children's life, and the generations that follow. In fact, those of you who know Plains Indian culture know that great decisions among the people that occupied this place sustainably for more than 5,000 years consisted of leaders who always considered the consequences as far-reaching as the seventh generation. If we'd start considering the seventh generation, we'd run this country and world a little bit different. Now, so you've had a good chance to look at that map. Some of you know that I lived in Saudi Arabia. I don't even know if this dang thing's working here, Jason. Oh yeah, here we go. I lived in Saudi Arabia. In fact, south of Riyadh, about right here at El Kharj, I was part of a project that built the world's largest dairy farm. 25,000 milking cows. We imported the cattle from Europe and the United States, and we processed all the milk, and then we shipped actually the Saudis are mostly lactose intolerant, so we made a drinkable yogurt called Laban in Arabic. And we shipped it all over the kingdom. And I went on to build a lot of other projects, irrigation projects, all over Saudi Arabia. I was there for about 7 years, so assalamu alaikum to all of you Arabic speakers. Alaikum salam, mumtaz. So take a good hard look at that map, and you'll see that I've placed Kuwait as the center of this map, and it's 1,000 nautical miles. And within 1,000 nautical miles, you'll see that it encompasses all of Iraq and Turkey. And of course, you've got Syria on up to Azerbaijan, which has been the most important oil center in the world during the last 100 years, all the way into Russia, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, all of Iran, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and across the Arabian Peninsula. 1,000 nautical miles. Now, this is pretty interesting because 40% of the world's oil supply is produced right in here. And most of it flows through the Strait of Hormuz right here. You've heard a little bit about the Strait of Hormuz. This is where the United Arab Emirates juts out. It's about 20 miles wide. And almost all of that 40% of the world's oil supply flows in supertankers right through that strait. Now, I got to tell you, in Washington, D.C. right now, there's a huge debate. What's the timeline? When are we going to get out of Iraq? Some say you can't have a timeline. It'll empower the terrorists. Others say, look, we've been there 4 years. They have their own Congress. They didn't have weapons of mass destruction. It's time for us to leave. We have to get out. All right, so I guess I will say the thing that they aren't willing to say to you because, of course, they're in Congress, and so they can't say the real things, and since I'm a governor, I just do that. We're not leaving. In fact, the whole time I lived in Saudi Arabia, we had 30,000 men and women in uniform in Saudi Arabia. And they moved, and then we added to that portfolio during the first Gulf War, and they went up to Kuwait, and we were stationed in Kuwait. We went back into Iraq. Now, I didn't think it was a great idea to go into Iraq, and I was public about that before we went in. Of course, had I been in Congress, I'd have been only one of 535 members of Congress who had actually lived in the region, and I would have said, well, that's a bad idea for a lot of reasons. But now we're there. And we're going to stay. Now, I don't think we're necessarily going to stay in Iraq. We'll probably keep a couple of military bases there, maybe 20, 30,000 troops, and we shouldn't be walking the streets of Baghdad. But now that we've created a vacuum, we've got to do something to keep the Iranians and Syrians, and then, of course, the Turks from killing the Kurds, and the Kurds from killing the Turks, and you get the picture. So we're going to be there. For example, I think we finished World War II well before most of the people in this room were born. and we still have 50,000 or more men and women in military in Central Europe. We finished the Korean War before I was born. We still have 30,000 in the Korean Peninsula. And neither one of them are as strategic to this country and the rest of the world as the Middle East, 40% of the world's oil supply. So you see, who among you didn't use oil during this last week? Oh, I see. So you're the problem. Yeah, you're the problem. As long as you're using oil, then you are part of the problem. As long as you're using oil, that means we will continue to import oil from some of the worst dictators in the world, and many of them live right here. Because that Strait of Hormuz, which is 20 miles wide, is actually controlled by Iran. Even during the time that I lived in Saudi Arabia 25 years ago, there were great big guns mounted in the side of that mountain. Did you ever see that movie, The Guns of Navarone? Did you ever see that? You know, those guns were mounted in the side of the mountain. You know, they were at a 45-degree angle, and they could shoot a shell the size of a coffee can 30 miles out to sea and sink a boat. Well, actually, the guns mounted in the Granite Mountains there on the coast there at the Strait of Hormuz, they're not mounted like this. They're mounted like this. And so at the day, the hour, the week, the month, the time of the choosing of Iran, they'll start sinking those boats. And when they do, the price of oil will go to $100, $200, $300 a barrel. Price of gasoline will go to $20 a gallon. The price of urea fertilizer will go to $3,000 a ton. You get the picture? We are totally dependent on that oil for our daily existence and all of our industrial processes, not just in the United States, but all over the world. So as long as we are dependent on that oil supply, you will be committing this generation, the next generation, the generation that follows, and maybe as much as the 7th generation to war in the Middle East. Well, I have a better idea. I hope you agree with me. Now take a look at this map. Remember we were saying 1,000 nautical miles? Just to give you, for those of you who haven't been in the Middle East, give you some perspective on how big that part of the world is. If the center of the map this time with 1,000 nautical miles is Kansas, it would take you from California to the Carolinas, from Manitoba to Monterey. Now let's say you had 130,000 men and women in uniform in Kansas. You had tanks, you had steel, you had all the accoutrements that you would need to back up those 130,000, 150,000 men and women, and they were prepared and mobile. And say you had an uprising, say, I don't know, if they had a hockey riot up here in Winnipeg or something. How long would it take us to put 100,000 straight up into Winnipeg? 100,000 men and women, and all of the backup and support that they'd need, all the fuel and the food and all the rest. How long would it take us to get down to Monterey if they embargoed, I don't know, Corona beer or something? How long would it take us to get to California or the Carolinas? There it is, 1,000 nautical miles. So as long as we are dependent on their oil, we're staying. We're going to be in Kuwait. We'll have a few in Iraq. Get used to it, and you're the problem. Montana has some real opportunities because we are an energy state, and we're a non-traditional energy state. We have wonderful wind resources. Steve Woodruff is here. And before I was elected governor, I actually wrote an opinion piece, and I was talking about using Montana's vast wind resources across eastern Montana. And since it's difficult to make wind power into firm power, I was proposing that we have a large number of wind turbines, and those wind turbines would generate electricity when the wind was blowing, and then we would have them associated with our dams that we have in Montana, and the dams would be like batteries storing that energy, and as the wind slowed down, then we would release more water through the turbines, and then we could generate electricity, and we could create firm power between our wind power and our hydropower. Well, Steve said to me he'd run that opinion piece. That'd be fine as long as we didn't build those turbines here in the Missoula Valley, because he doesn't like the looks of them. Remember that, Steve? So not in my backyard or anybody else's backyard. We have a great opportunity in producing biofuels. I'm not a real big fan on traditional ethanol, corn ethanol. It's okay, but you're actually trading energy for energy, and you're trading petroleum inputs through urea fertilizer and diesel for an ethanol response. But with new cellulosic 15, 20 years out, and with biodiesel, it might be all right. Boy, Montana's got coal. We have 120 billion tons of coal. That's 28% of the world's coal supply. Of the nation's coal supply. It's 8% of the world's coal supply. We have equivalent of the number of BTUs of Iran and Saudi Arabia combined in coal. But of course, as you know, coal is a four-letter word for a lot of reasons. Dirty, creates a lot of CO2. Over the years, it's created a lot of mercury and sulfur and particulate matter. But 50% of the country's electric supply, 60% of the world's electric supply comes from coal, old, dirty coal. Smokestack, big smokestack, a lot of carbon dioxide. That's not going to change in the next 10 years or 20 years or 30 years. So this is going to be part of the portfolio. We just have to clean it up. Montana's been producing coal for a lot of years. If you go back all the way to 1952, we were producing about 1 million ton and got out to about 1968, and it markedly increased and continued to increase until you got to about 1988. And from 1988 until the present, it's leveled out at about 40 million ton. So we've been producing. It seems like there are certain times in Montana's history where we get active in developing energy, and then there's times that we're a little bit sleepy in developing energy. Probably across Montana, there's people talking about energy development in Montana, and in these coffee shops and these bars, and as they get to talking about energy development, somebody will say, you know, these coffee clutches, and they'll say, well, that Schweitzer, he's on about that wind power, and he's interested in this clean coal technology, and he's trying to develop oil and gas and all these other things, and biodiesel. But, you know, he's a Democrat. It's okay, but dang Democrats, they don't like energy, and so they're not going to allow them. We got so many Democrats in this state, they're just not going to allow energy development to occur in this state. Well, that might be true in some other states, but now you've had a chance to really download what this chart shows. It seems like in Montana, when you have Republican governors, not so much. Democrats, yeah, giddy up. Then this area, I was too young to remember any of this and only some of that, but I remember this time. Why, they were talking about, we can develop energy in this state, it's those doggone environmentalists that are shutting us down. Well, during this time, the Republicans controlled the whole state. They had the legislature and supermajorities, they had everything that mattered, they had it, and of course all they did was talk about developing energy, and of course not so much. Wyoming was actually developing a lot of energy in those years. And back in 1988, they were producing 4 times as much coal as us. By the time we got to the president, they're producing 10 times as much coal as us. So somebody was developing coal. Well, you're thinking, well, maybe it was that we had switched our development system in Montana. Maybe we were developing our energy with something else. Well, follow this one. Once again, these are the blues and reds. These are the generation capacity increases that we've had over the course of the last 30 years. And you'll see coal strip 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and then, well, these years. Oh, I was elected here. In 2.5 years, we've increased our electricity generation portfolio more than we did in 20 years combined before that. Montana has a lot of energy resources, and I'm actually attempting to get a lot of folks to come to Montana. We'll talk about wind and we'll talk about biofuels in a bit, but here's our energy resources. We have a lot of coal. We have bituminous coal, which is this gray. That's 11,000 BTU, 20% moisture. Then we have subbituminous in this color. And then we have lignite. Lignite's about 6,000 BTU, and it's about 35% water. Now, I also show our transmission lines. We've been delivering electrons to the West Coast from our coal-fired plants now for 30 years. And of course, I show our pipelines. In green, you have our gas fields. In red, you have where we're producing oil. And so Montana is the treasure state. Actually, I don't know if any of you followed this, but about 10 months ago, I was in Bozeman, and I was speaking to a group of 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders and their parents, and I get excited because I'm a soil scientist, and I'm excited about the geology of Montana, and I was explaining to them, we were looking out at the Bridger Mountains, and that's the Madison limestone that's been turns straight up and makes a wonderful ski resort. But the Madison limestone continues out across eastern Montana. In some places, it's one of the greatest aquifers in the world. In some places, it stores oil and gas. And in other places, it provides an opportunity for us to sequester a great deal of carbon dioxide. And so I was explaining how that limestone was formed in the inland seas that were created over the course of the last couple of billion years, and explaining how some of these hydrocarbons were trapped, the oil and gas and the coal, and how we had created the sandstones and the shales and the limestones. And I was asking the kids questions as you go along, and if you've been teachers, you know that you can't just talk, you got to ask them questions, you have to engage them. How many of you think this? How many of you think that? Who can tell me something else? And so I was going along about this, and I thought, oh wait, well how many of you here think that the world's just 400 million or 500 million or billion years old? How many of you think that the world's old like that? Oh, these kids raise their hands, and their parents and teachers raise their hand. I said, okay, so I started again talking about the inland seas and talking about the formation, and then I thought, oh boy, wait. So I said, well, how many of you think that the world is 4,000 years old? And the state legislator from that area raised his hand. So it's a little tough. It's a little tough to make laws where we're talking about sequestering carbon dioxide and explaining to legislators about hydrocarbons and how 60 million years ago we had a very warm planet with a lot of CO2, and we created all of this vegetation, and all of this vegetation was collecting all of this CO2 and capturing the hydrogen and carbon in these leaves, and then it died and it was covered over by an ocean. And now we're in a hydrocarbon economy where we bring that coal and oil and gas back to the surface, and when you disassociate the hydrogen from a carbon by burning it, you get a burst of energy, and that's good, but then the CO2 goes into the atmosphere, and that's bad. And that we've increased carbon dioxide by 100 parts per million at the rate we're going to increase it by 250 parts per million, and we're rapidly going back to that climate that we had 60 million years ago, which is when the dinosaurs were okay with this place and we weren't. It's tough for me to talk to a legislature about creating laws to capture carbon when I have legislators who don't believe that there were inland oceans. We have some real opportunities in actually producing liquid fuels from coal, and it's a real job creator. In Montana, we have two distinct economies, at least two distinct economies, but I'll break it into two. I call it the cowboy boot of western Montana. If you start in Flathead and head on down through Missoula and Bitterroot, then head east in the middle of the foot is in Gallatin County, and the toe would be Billings. That's the cowboy boot. And within the cowboy boot of Montana, we have the fastest growing economy in America. If we were a single state, we'd be about mid-range for size of states, but we would be the fastest growing economy in America. If you built a great big fence around western Montana, 12 feet high, like they're talking about doing in Washington, D.C., between us and Mexico, if you built a fence 12 feet high around western Montana, Walmart would sell 14-foot ladders, and they're going to come anyway. At the rate we're going to fill every single one of these mountain valleys, and we're going to look like California, unless we get it right. Now, that's a great economy, but the driver of that economy is no longer timber industry. It's no longer the mining industry. It is the people industry. People are moving to Montana because it is the greatest place in the world to raise a family, to educate your kids, to build a community, safe schools, and abundant opportunities for hunting, camping, and fishing. People come here because they can leverage their property here in the Missoula Valley or in the Flathead Valley, the Bitterroot, the Gallatin Valley. You buy a house with a half an acre of land, and you get to leverage another 1 million acres of federally owned land around you with very little footprint in it, so that we have open spaces and abilities for transportation where you're not so angry by the time you get to work that you just want to quit, like you do in California or even some places in Colorado in the Midwest and on the East Coast. Still a great place to live, but if you do not plan for the future, you won't be happy with the results when you get there. And the time to plan is today. Now, that means, and I actually been saying that for a couple of years, and of course in the Bitterroot, I always have people come from the Bitterroot, and they come to me and they say, Governor, what are you going to do about our land use planning in the Bitterroot? We've got to do something. I mean, my gosh, it's terrible what's happening. We've got people moving in. We have trailer houses that are built next to $1 million houses. People aren't planning with roads. We can't get in and out. It takes us an hour to get to Missoula from Hamilton. What are you going to do? I said, you're coming from the Bitterroot and asking the governor about what I'm going to do? What are you going to do? You need to elect local officials that will plan for the future. You need county commissioners and a planning board that recognizes that the greatest engine that we have in our economy is quality of life, and that they need to plan so that we can continue to have a high quality of life. Well, I'll be danged. Did you see what happened in the Bitterroot here during the last election? They threw the rascals out that didn't believe in land use planning, and they brought the people in who did. So I think things will probably change in the Bitterroot, and I bet you they're going to start changing across western Montana, because a lot of people are recognizing that the engine in western Montana is quality of life. Well, in eastern Montana it's a little different, and just so happens that's where we have a lot of coal, that's where we have a lot of other resources, and it creates a lot of jobs. But I'm going to tell you something, you cannot develop coal, and you will not develop coal, and you shall not develop coal, and you should not develop coal unless you can provide for the carbon dioxide. And this is some complicated physics and chemistry, and for those of you who went to the University of Montana, just bear with me, I'll go through some of this. Oh. When you burn a ton of coal, remember I was talking about disassociating that hydrogen from that carbon? For every ton of coal that you burn, you produce 2 tons of carbon dioxide. I think it's complicated, but oxygen weighs a lot, and we'll just leave it at that. Point is, that's a lot of carbon dioxide. And 50% of the electricity in this country comes from coal. And unless we do something about that portfolio of electricity that we're using coal on today, we are going to continue to lead the world in production of carbon dioxide. Actually, I say that, but China's now overtaken us. And at the rate that they're going, they'll be producing twice as much carbon dioxide as the United States in 30 years. They're building the equivalent of one new 500 megawatt coal-fired plant with the old technology that we've used for the last 50 years per week. And so this is a global problem, and the problem we have in the United States is we have no standing. We can't go to China and say, doggone you folks, you can't continue burning coal and producing all that CO2, you're going to destroy the planet. They're going to say, whoa, wait a minute here. You've been doing it for 100 years. You're almost solely responsible for the increase of 100 parts per million of CO2 in our atmosphere, and you're telling us that we can't do it? And so until we get a handle on CO2, we don't have standing in the third world. How can we tell India and China that you don't get to have a middle class because you're not allowed to use the same hydrocarbons that we've used for the last 100 years? So we need to lead the world in developing this technology of sequestering carbon dioxide. Now, there are those of you in the room, I know some of you, that just hate coal. You say, Brian, we love the other things you're talking about, but why are you talking about coal? We hate coal. Well, I'll go through the math again. 50% of the electricity produced in this country right now comes from coal. 60% of the electricity produced in the world comes from coal. It's the cheapest source of electricity in the world. And we're not going to change that during the next 20 or 30 or probably 40 years. What we can change is we can change the way we use that coal, and we can sequester that carbon dioxide. And that's why in Montana we have developed a study to find those geologic structures where we can store that carbon dioxide. And we've identified so many wonderful places to store that carbon dioxide that all of the coal-fired plants that we have in Montana, we could store all of that carbon dioxide for the hundreds more years. In fact, we could multiply that portfolio by 10 and still store all of that carbon dioxide below the surface of Montana. And we'll get back to, the world being 4,000 years old. People talk about the Earth having been formed in 7 days, as you know. And so Montana is the treasure state. And of course, originally we were called the treasure state because of, well, we had copper, gold, and silver, and of course we have coal and oil and gas and platinum and palladium. We were called the treasure state 100 years ago because of all the minerals that were contained in the mountain. But today, most of us in this room know that we are the treasure state because of the mountain itself and the watershed and the wildlife habitat and the last wild places in the lower 48. We are the treasure state. And of course, we'll go back to the notion that, the earth was formed 4,000 years ago during 7 days. And so we'll go with that theory for a little while. And the way I see it was this. God went out and practiced. He got Europe and Asia, Africa, built Australia, built the rest of the United States. And then on the seventh day, sat back, reflected on what he had managed to accomplish, and he made Montana the treasure state. Must be because we have all of this coal and we have the greatest zones for sequestering that carbon dioxide. By the way, we have a real problem because we have, in Washington, D.C., they're actively considering carbon law right now. They're saying, should we have a cap and trade system? In other words, should we put a cap on the amount of CO2 that we produce in this country right now and franchise all of those people who are producing that carbon dioxide to produce that part of the carbon dioxide with the agreement that they will decrease those CO2 emissions by 20 or 30% 20 years from now and by 40% 40 years from now. And others say, no, that's a bad idea because now what you're doing is effectively franchising the biggest polluters in the country and creating value for their companies because they've been producing carbon dioxide. Others say, let's just have a carbon tax of $30 a ton, and then those who are producing high quantities of carbon will have to pay to those who are decreasing. But we got the cart way out in front of the horse. In fact, I was back testifying before the Senate, testified before House, and I explained some basic things that we don't understand about carbon sequestration. It isn't about the geology. We understand that. We've been doing that for 30 years, sequestering carbon dioxide. What we don't have worked out is the legal system. Now, I'm not a lawyer. Kind of proud of that. But think about some of these things I'm going to describe for you right now. Now, on my ranches in Montana, I own ranches in Montana, I know who owns the surface because if I go down to the courthouse, all 56 counties, we have a book like this, and I can open that book up and I'll go to my township, my range, my section, my quarter, and aha, there it is. Brian and Nancy Schweitzer are the owner of that surface. Somebody says to me, well, who owns the oil and gas, coal under your ranch? Danged if I know. That's in a book over on the other side of the courthouse. So if you go over to the minerals book, you open it up, township and range, section, quarter, and there you are, and go, whoa, look at that. You got federal government owns 25%, railroad owns 25%, dead lady in Omaha owns about 10%, somebody I've never heard of owns 10%, and I own 6%. We have split estates in most of the states in the western United States. Who in this room can tell me who has the right to pump carbon dioxide under my ranch? Oh, imagine that. We're talking about, in Congress right now, developing a $12 trillion industry of trading carbon dioxide and sequestering it in these wonderful geologic zones, and we don't even know who legally has the right to pump it under my ranch. Now, let's just speculate a little bit. Now, would that belong to the mineral right owner because they have the right to extract oil and gas from some of those storage areas? So does that mean that they have the right to pump the carbon dioxide in? Well, I don't think so. Well, what about the surface owner? You own the surface rights, and so that means you own everything unless specifically the law says somebody else owns it, like the mineral rights. Maybe you have the right to pump in that void space 10,000 feet below the surface. I don't know. In Montana, of course, you don't own the water under your ranch necessarily. In fact, our Constitution says that the water belongs to the people of Montana and shall be used for the beneficial use of the people of Montana. And of course, you can have a water right, a right to use that water, but it doesn't give you, the surface owner, or the mineral owner, the right to pump that CO2 under the surface. So we're developing a $12 trillion industry without even the basic legal questions answered. And oh, by the way, who has the liability if the CO2 escapes during the first 50 years or the next 100 years or the next 10,000? Well, there's another can of worms. Haven't worked it out. That's for the lawyers. I'm a lowly soil scientist and the governor of Montana. Now let's move along to something else that Steve doesn't like, but the rest of us do, and that's wind power. Take a look at that map. Now, the darker the colors on that map, it means the more wind potential you have. Black, best, dark blue, good, blue. How'd you like to live in Montana? best wind resources in the country if you consider all the way down to Category 3 wind power, which is mostly what they're using in Europe. Now on this map, any place where you have blue, and you'll see those are the mountaintops in western Montana, or any green, that is Class 3 or better. So basically 2/3 of the state has world-class wind areas. On this map, I've included the transmission lines that we have across Montana. So in developing wind power in Montana, you want to make sure that you A, have the wind, and B, you have transmission lines to move it around. When I was elected governor 2.5 years ago, Montana, with better wind resources than any state in the union, we were producing less electricity with our wind power than virtually every other state in the country. We were producing less electricity from wind power than Rhode Island. Rhode Island's not even a decent-sized ranch in Montana, and they were producing more. Well, we got the legislature to pass some legislation that mandates that our default supplier, Northwestern Energy, shall now provide 15% of their electricity portfolio from renewables by the year 2015. And that spurred an explosion of wind energy development. We're nearly at 10% already, and we now have developers coming to Montana to produce another $1 billion worth of wind energy during the next 2 years. And just about 2 weeks ago, I spent a couple of days with the 3rd largest manufacturer of wind turbines in the world, a German company. And they weren't just coming to Montana to have a look around, they were coming to Montana to decide which of 5 towns are they going to build their wind turbines in. So not only will we be producing wind power, we'll be producing the wind turbines in Montana. Montana's leading the world in alternative energy, and I got to tell you, I'm kind of proud of that. The problem with wind energy is it's not firm energy. I grew up in central Montana, and to be honest with you, I assumed the wind blew all the time, because every moment that I could remember in the Judith Basin, it was blowing. In fact, I have one leg that's shorter than the other leg because of the wind that was blowing out there. But it doesn't blow all the time. It doesn't blow economically all the time. And even though we have great wind resources and it blows as much as 40 or even 45% of the time at high enough speeds that we can generate electricity, it still means that you have to have some redundancy. So if you spend $1 billion on building these big old wind turbines that cost $1.5 million to $3 million each and put the transmission lines in, they're only working at best 45% of the time. So it means that you have to do a couple of things. A, you'd have to go out and build what we call peaking plants with gas, so that when the wind decreases, then you can peak with gas and start ramping up some electricity generation to firm that power. Or you could use those hydroelectric dams that we have in Montana. And the third way, and this is another remarkable way, is what's called compressed air energy storage. Imagine in this treasure state, if in places where we have world-class wind and we had transmission lines, can you establish those, right? Red lines, transmission lines, any place where it's green or blue, world-class wind resources. But let's do one more thing. Let's imagine that 2,000 to 6,000 feet below the surface, we had some big void space that had shale above it and shale below it, so that you could pump a great deal of air and store it at very high pressures. And so then let's presume furthermore that these turbines, when the wind's blowing, you don't generate electricity, but you compress air. And when the wind is blowing, you add to the portfolio of compressed air in that geologic zone, and then you have a pipe coming out of that geologic zone that runs a turbine at a constant speed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now, if we had some of those geologic zones that were co-located with places where we have wind and where we have transmission lines, well, that'd be better than a gold mine, right? Just so happens that we do. We've already identified where we have those yellow dots. These are places that we have the geologic structures where we could produce compressed air energy storage systems and create firm power with Montana's wind resources. We are the treasure state. And of course, we already generate a lot more electricity than we consume. We produce nearly 6,000 megawatts of electricity, and we only consume about 2,000 megawatts. And so we're actually shipping electricity to the West Coast and other states. We have been for years. In order for us to ship these clean electrons someplace else, there has to be some new transmission lines. A Canadian company has proposed to build a new transmission line from eastern Montana, that's the blue line, to Las Vegas, Los Angeles, and Phoenix. Now, take a look at this. This is a very old photo, and this is from about 1930, and it's on the High Line. It's about 10 miles from the Canadian border. And what you have over on this side, see this oil barrel there? In the winter, these farmers would go over to the Sweetgrass Hills and they'd buy oil by the barrel, crude oil, by the barrel. And they'd bring it back to the farm, and during the winter, they would make their own gasoline, diesel, and kerosene. And they would back their old trucks up there, they'd roll those barrels up there, and then they'd put a bung in it, and that would run into a pipe. That pipe would run into this big old cauldron here. And then they would ignite it, and that vapor would rise through this pipe. See here, rise there, go all the way out to here. And by the time it got back to here, it was a liquid, and they'd put about 6 or 8 of those barrels of crude oil in there. And for a little while, they'd call it gasoline, and then for a little while, they'd call it diesel, and everything else they'd call kerosene. And they'd make their own. Now, the only control mechanism, I know a little bit about this particular still, the only control mechanism was this little fellow down here who had a cable, and it was connected to the flue, and he just kind of watched the smoke. And there was no pressure gauges, no temperature gauges, and one operator would sit by that thing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, until they'd produced all the fuel they needed for the farm. And the reason I know about this particular still is because that's my dad when he was 13 years old. Now, those homesteaders, they knew a thing or two about producing their own energy. My dad's 87 now, and he can remember exactly how many bushels of wheat he harvested on every field 50 years ago, but I'll be damned if he can find his keys around the house. It's the way it works. But you know, I sit down with my dad every once in a while, and I learn things from him. And so I said to Dad one time, Dad, what was the biggest change in your life when rural electrification came to the farm? My dad thought about it a little bit. He's German, so he thinks a lot before he speaks. I'm half Irish, so that's the political part of this thing. So he thinks about this a long time, and then he says out loud, well, you know, it was 1948 before we got that rural electrification. They brought those copper wires out there. And so the question is, what was the biggest change in my life when rural electrification came to the farm? He said, well, you know, I guess it was we could weld at a little hotter temperature. Because on his farm and farms all over North and South Dakota and Montana and Minnesota and Iowa and Montana, they had wind chargers as early as 1923. We were completely electrified in rural Montana, in rural America in 1925 and 30. We produced our own electricity on our own farms. We weren't connected to a coal-fired plant 1,000 miles away. We had batteries in our basement. When the wind blew, we stored electricity, and when it didn't, we used the electricity from our batteries. And the biggest change in my father's life is he could weld at a little hotter temperature. And now, in Washington, D.C., 435 members of Congress and 100 senators are trying to find a way that this country could have a diversified, clean, and green energy system. I wonder how. Now, we also can learn a few things from these homesteaders, because now that's in 1930 they were producing their oil, but in Montana, the sod was busted in about 1910 to 1912. And we had horsepower, and it was produced on all of those farms. Those farms busted that sod, and they grew all of their own horsepower on their own farm in 1910 in Montana. And what were they growing? What was the crops that they grew to produce their horsepower? Oats. You couldn't homestead 320 acres and put it all in wheat. On your own farm, you had to produce the horsepower. So you'd plant 20, 30, 40 acres of oats, and a little later, by the 20s, they were planting a little alfalfa. And you'd feed the horses who pulled the plow, and then later pulled the harvester, and then later those horses would pull the wagons and take the grain to market. Oh boy, do we have a better system now. Here's the way it works now in rural America. In January, every January, farmer goes in to see his banker. Now I know how this works because I'm a third-generation farmer. And you go in to see the banker, and you sit down, you got all your records and spreadsheet, not all of them, because, well, you don't want the banker to know all of the things that are happening. And you explain to him that, okay, yeah, we didn't make the yields we were hoping, and the price was a little lower than we'd anticipated, and so we came up a little bit short, but you've already prayed that they'd come with you. And of course, they're not going anyplace else. They're going to stick with you because they need you worse than you need them, and they know it and you know it. And so they loan you the money for the next year. You get your line of credit, and the next day you go out and you buy all the fuel that you're going to need for the year. You call your fertilizer dealer and you make a deal and you buy all of your fertilizer and you start buying the parts for all of your equipment. You put some money aside for labor, and then you get your crop planted, and then you spray it, and then you harvest your crop, and you work for 364 days. You spend money for 364 days, put it in your grain bin, and on the 364th day, after spending money for 364 days, you give 35% of the value of the crop to the railroad. And the railroad puts your wheat on the train and hauls it all the way over to the port, and they put it on a big boat and send it to the third world. And that big old boat heads off for the third world. Meanwhile, some dictator in North Africa or the Middle East got some minions out there. They're drilling a well and putting some pipes together, and that crude oil makes it all the way over to their port, and they put the crude oil on a ship. And somewhere out on the high seas, those two boats cross. The Filipino crews on both boats wave to each other. The oil arrives at our port. We refine it, and it's put back on the train or in a pipeline and shipped all the way back inland. And the farmer buys the diesel and maybe even the urea fertilizer to start the whole cycle over again. Oh boy. And 100 years ago, the farmers produced their own horsepower on their own farm, creating jobs for themselves during the winter in clean and green energy. Well, once again, Washington, D.C., they're pulling their hair out trying to get this thing figured out, how we can do it. And meanwhile, we were doing it 100 years ago. And in Montana, we can grow wonderful crops of diesel. We have some great crops. We have safflower, of course. We have canola. We can grow soybeans in some of our lower elevations. And more recently, about 6 years ago, we introduced a crop. It's a beautiful name, camelina. Isn't that a nice name? Camelina, she's with a beautiful yellow flower, and she grows very rapidly. She starts with a very small seed that germinates at a cooler temperature than anything else that we grow. So you don't need herbicides. You plant it, it gets out of the ground before the weeds or any other crops. It has big leaves, and so it covers the ground before other crops can germinate. And you harvest it about 30 days before you would harvest wheat. It's a wonderful rotation. Camelina, isn't that a beautiful name? If I had another daughter, I'd name her Camelina. And you can grow camelina all over eastern Montana, and you can produce up to 150 gallons of diesel per acre with camelina. And in Washington, D.C., they're figuring out how we could ever get back to producing our own energy on our own farms. And meanwhile, we're doing it in Montana. The cowboy boot of Montana would be those white areas in western Montana where people are moving in at a faster rate than we can find a home for them. And eastern Montana is where we can produce the biodiesel, the camelina, and we have crushing plants where you have blue stars, and we're building more. Now, there's the energy resources of Montana, and it's not just coal, it's not just oil, it's not just gas. It is not just biodiesel, and it's not just wind power. The real energy resources of Montana are going to be our people, because we cannot lead the world in developing an alternative energy unless we can train people for these emerging jobs. So the real stars of Montana are our four-year colleges in blue, our two-year public colleges of technology in yellow, our green colleges, private colleges. You get the picture, because Montana today has the lowest unemployment in America. Can you imagine that? We have the lowest unemployment in the history of Montana, but today we have the lowest unemployment in America. So we have to retrain adults for these emerging jobs that we have in alternative energy. And we'll get it right. But we got a lot of work in front of us. Here's the skill level needed in the workforce. If you go back to 1950 on your left, you'll see that in 1950, 60% of the jobs in Montana were for unskilled laborers. That's in the blue. And if you see the blue lines with the white, you'll see that roughly 20% of the workforce were skilled and roughly 20% were professional. Today, in Montana, you'll see that we have fewer than 15% of our jobs for unskilled labor, and you'll see that the overwhelming majority are for skilled labor. And the only way we get skilled labor in Montana is to train them at our colleges. We have some makeup work to do. Once again, I'll show you historically what's occurred in Montana. This is going back in time all the way back to 1991, and this is state funding per A and B. In Helena, we don't call them students or children, we call them average number belonging, A and B. And so this is the funding in dollars per student across Montana. And you'll see back here in 91, and these are in real dollars, these aren't inflation-adjusted dollars, we were spending right around $3,000. And then something happened around 1993, and boy, look at that. We started decreasing the amount of money that we were putting in education, K-12. Look at that. In fact, we got all the way out to 2001 before we got back to the level that we were in 1991. This isn't inflation-adjusted, folks. This is just spending less money. And of course, for those of you who have been, any of you trained as economists? Hell, I wouldn't admit it either. But an economist would tell you that if you're spending the same amount of money today as you did 8 years ago, you're spending a heck of a lot less, like a half, because, you know, you got inflation at work here. So we were spending nearly 10 years later the same amount of money. And so then you'll notice actually the March years here increase the spending a little bit. And then something happened in 2005 in Montana. And this is the spending increases that we've had during the last 2.5 years in Montana. Anybody venture to guess what happened in 2005? Well, maybe the people that are running this state believe passionately in higher education. It was higher education they were spending their money in, not K-12. That could be. So let's go back there. 1993, we were spending $5,500 per resident university student in Montana, the state funding. $5,500. And those same drought years, look what happened. And then even the March years weren't particularly good when it got to higher education. Of course, they were actually terrible. And then that same thing happened in 2005. If we're going to invest in the future, we're going to invest in the best trained workforce in America, the best trained workforce in the world, and that means we invest today for the future. Because if we don't, you are committing the next 7 generations to war. You're committing the next 7 generations to simply producing more carbon dioxide from the same old hydrocarbons, enriching the same dictators from Timbuktu and worse, all across the world. Now, there's a guy by the name of Tom Brokaw. Anybody remember who Tom Brokaw is? Yeah. Well, Tom Brokaw started out in South Dakota. In fact, he grew up in South Dakota. He married Miss South Dakota, Meredith Brokaw. And then they started this broadcasting career and took him to the West Coast and East Coast, turned out being kind of a big shot back east. And then about 8 years ago, he did what all really bright people do. He bought a ranch in Montana. And during the last 5 years, Meredith has been attempting to spend all the money that they've made on horses. And she's nearly accomplished the goal. But they enjoy their ranch in Montana. But Tom Brokaw wrote a very famous book. What was that book? The Greatest Generation. Greatest Generation. And the premise of The Greatest Generation was simply this: that those people, the age of my parents, who grew up during the Great Depression, that time where 50% of America went to bed hungry, and as much as 70% of America had no idea where they would live next year because they were pretty sure they couldn't afford the house that they were living in right now. Graduates from high school from 1931 to about 1936, less than 50% of them even knew someone with a job. And people in this country were looking at one another and openly saying, does democratic capitalism even work? Is this a failed experiment? What comes next? This was a whole generation of people that were reared in an era where there was no hope for the future. And yet they survived, and they made it through, and then they were challenged one more time. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, this country, which had the 5th most powerful military in the world at that time, we industrialized our military, and in a 4-year period, we built our armaments. We built our ships and our boats and our guns and our planes. We trained our military in a 4-year period. We trained our military and we defeated the tyrants in Europe and Asia, and it was this greatest generation. Tom Brokaw says they were the greatest generation. He might be right. I don't know. I wasn't there. I read the history books. But I was there. Remember in early 1960s, all of America was looking into the night sky. We were looking into the night sky because, well, the Russians had launched a satellite. And we couldn't understand how the Russians managed to get a generation ahead of us in aerospace technology. And it scared the bejesus out of us because it meant that the Russians had superior engineering technology to us. It meant that Russian economy was greater and better equipped for technological advancement and innovation than we were. And we looked into that night sky, and I still remember, I was only 6, 7 years old, but at night, we'd look into the sky for the star that was moving. And it was, what was the name of that? It was Sputnik. And you know, it was President Kennedy. After his advisors said to him, Mr. President, we don't even know that you can land on the moon. We have no idea how we would get there, and we don't even know if the surface of the moon would support any kind of a vessel. Well, he heard from some of his advisors that, and then he had some dreamers that said, we're the Americans. We can do anything if we believe. And so he stood before the American people, and it wasn't long before he was assassinated in Houston, and he challenged us. He said to the American people, we will do what it takes. We will have our universities work with our corporations. We will ask teachers to train 5-year-olds to be the future engineers. We will make every sacrifice. We will turn over every rock, and we, the American people, will put a man on the moon in 10 years. What a dreamer. And when we landed that Apollo mission, we had less computing capacity on board than your cell phone. That was a leader who challenged America, who said to us, you can be greater than yourself. He challenged every elementary teacher to find the next scientist and engineer. He challenged every engineer to think bigger than anything they'd ever thought before. He challenged our corporations to work with our public sector. And in a 10-year period, America had created the most magnificent aerospace technology in the world, and we still lead. I'm going to tell you, unless we find leaders in this country that will challenge us, when was the last time we were asked to sacrifice? When was the last time we had a leader that touched our innovative bone and said, America can lead in alternative energy. Of course we can sequester carbon dioxide. Of course we can produce clean and green energy. Of course we can export this technology all over the world. Of course we can do that if our public and private sectors work together, if every teacher in America has a single goal, and that is to find the next scientist that will change the world. Of course we can do that if they would ask. Question I have is whether we have what it takes to be what would be the greatest generation. Because either our generation will get this right, or we will commit generations to come to continuing to increasing carbon dioxide emissions, continuing to enrich dictators, and waiting for the generation that would be the greatest generation. So, I'm sorry if I'm kind of downbeat right now, but look, we have an opportunity, because if we get this right, it will be the greatest boom to America's economy in the history of this country. It'll be greater than the Industrial Revolution. It'll make the internet boom look like we were fooling around, because the entire world is in the same shape, and they're all looking to us. They all are begging us to lead, and instead, we bumble. We have an opportunity, but it's time that we have leaders that challenge us, and I hope you're the leaders that can do it. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.